had begun to write a traditional linear novel about this story. But it didn't work, even though in part it emerged, albeit totally transformed, into the final version. It couldn't work because in a narrative, the how, namely the style, the structure, the writing, must correspond, better must identify with the what, with the event and with its meaning or non-meaning. One cannot write in a traditional, ordered, rational, harmonious manner on a subject of delirium, of disintegration of all sense, of abnormal disorder. One cannot write with rational order the story of a tragic disorder. The disorder and the tragedy are in the things and in the words. I was also sucked into a creative and critical whirlpool into which I had already ventured to a certain extent, but never this far, into the great Conradian sea, which is the modern contemporary novel, whose structure derives from the breaking up, contrasting or altering of the way meaning is revealed and time and history fundamentally relate. These themes have also appeared in my critical work, for instance, in the essays on Hoffman, and in my fiction too, but in particular in Blindly. The essential point in the writing of that book, together with the difficulties I encountered, concerns the relationship between the contemporary novel and the history, between writing history and writing stories, between narrating reality and inventing it. The destruction of the linear concept of time and the eclipse of the central meaning capable of bestowing unity and rationality upon events, both individual and collective, have made a violent assault on the way storytelling relates to the meaning of history. Here is a contradiction we cannot avoid confronting. A genuine novel of our time cannot recount history if it is not like that nightmare of which Stephen Dedalus spoke, or like the grotesquely contorted series of events, disjointed and irrational, in Grass, the Tin Drum, or like fragments scattered in a vortex in which it is difficult, if not impossible, to detect any meaning. I believe we cannot not feel embroiled in this disintegration. As Franco Marenco has written, the great narratives are no longer the story of the West, but rather of its peripheries and its sad memories, different memories. This is the only possible fictional truth. Equally necessary and obvious at this point, it seems to me, is the rejection of that fraudulent postmodern cult which is under the illusion of having placed in the official files or relegated to the attic the tragic, still open wound of the modern, which we have yet to come to terms with. Writing blindly, I was grappling with the division between that form of truth which the novel, if it wishes to be genuine, can search for only through distortion, and that other form of truth which, for example, in the ethical, political context, can be reached only by trusting into that reason and that rationality which the surging breakers of the epic seem to have founded. But what must an honest and at the same time imaginative intelligence do when confronting the world? In practice, during the actual undertaking, we discover or presuppose, as in the old mathematical demonstrations we studied at school and which always began and so on. We discover rationality in the things we seek to confront. But when one passes, for instance, from the political problem of, say, pensions in general, to an account of the vicissitudes of an individual pensioner, of a particular individual ensnared in history, we discover that this rationality does not exist, that the nexus between individuality and history, upon which sound politics are or should be based, and upon which the great 19th century novel is also based, is shattered beyond recall. For the 19th century novel, great or small, the action of individual was at bottom integrated into a difficult but not wholly irrational history. All that gave a humanistic sense of unity between the world and its representation. When he was asked who the greatest French writer of the 19th century was, Gide replied, Victor Hugo, hélas. Personally, I continue to believe, despite my great affection for Hugo, that Stendhal or Flaubert are greater. But the meaning of Gide's reply is very clear. The 19th century writer, even when he invented stories, could rely upon the same conception of history which he expressed in his historical and political writing, could employ a style in some way analogous. The writing of Victor Hugo in Les Miserables is none too different from that of his polemics against Napoleon III. Kafka, by contrast, would not have been able to write his novels in the style of everyday communication or political statement. Likewise, the writing of the nighttime works of Ernesto Sabato is radically different, could not help being so, from that of his moral daytime pages directed against the dictatorship of the Argentinian generals. Today, to the question put to Gide, we will not be able to reply by pointing to a great harmonious humanist writer. We will have to cite, for example, Musil, Kafka, or Faulkner. But can we too add, hélas, should we? I felt this problem strongly when I was working on the draft, or rather drafts of Blindly, in which I continually found myself reckoning with disintegration, shipwreck, the inevitable senselessness and irrationality of the events I was narrating, and with the attempt, despite all, to go in search of that fragmented meaning, somewhat like a searching for that red thread which, Goethe said, is to be found in all the ropes of the British fleet, thereby indicating that in all the variety of ship sails and so on, there was a sense, a unity, which conferred meaning. This meaning one looks for, even if in the search the red thread snaps. Writing is both a customs officer and a passeur. It establishes borders and transgresses them. But there is writing and writing. Moral or political writing seeks to mark out, albeit in various forms, borders between good and evil, the licit and the illicit, what one can do and cannot do. It is written in the Gospel, let your speech be yea, yea, nay, nay. By contrast, the story of life is by definition the crossing of these borders, inasmuch as we penetrate into that gray zone, to use Primo Levi's phrase, which is often life's characteristic terrain. Literature must understand and must therefore in some way identify with what it wants to understand, in particular with mankind, with the hearts and minds of men, even if this entails hearts and minds that do evil. From this point of view, literature always risks a certain complicity with its subject and presupposes some empathy with the creators it brings to life, even if they do evil. It is also written in the Gospel, judge not, perhaps in the belief that understanding certainly demands a clear, cut judgment on the transgression of values, but that such judgment is not sufficient to understand the human morass implied by the transgression of those values. All this is reflected, or rather of necessity embodied, in the style, in the syntax, in the music of the writing. In the ethical political text, also in mine, the style is laconic, paratactic, urgent, and precise in both formulation and judgment. On the other hand, in the narratives, to the tangle of events that defy all clarity, and in particular all interpretation, continually modified and contradicted, there corresponds a hypotactic, sinuous, agglutinant style, which in the same sentence affirms and modifies or demolishes the affirmation itself, which contradicts the main clause in the subordinate and goes forward and back, confusing the borders.